Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Dr. Lloyd Sederer. I'll tell you all about Dr. Sederer in just a moment. But those of you who know the show know that Grace Under Pressure is an interview show where I talk to thought leaders and doers like Dr. Sederer. And we talk about what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the connecting, the commitment we feel toward others. Grace for me is a generosity we show, the respect we give, and the compassion we demonstrate. And when you do it as a leader, especially during challenging times, it requires that ability to act for others and energize the organization. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lloyd Sederer.
I'm delighted to be here, John. Thank you for having me.
Great. Lloyd, as he asked me to call him, is a psychiatrist and public health doctor who's held some of the most prestigious mental health jobs in the world. A medical director at Harvard Teaching Hospital, mental health commissioner for the city of New York, chief medical officer for mental health for NYS, and a medical editor for mental health. Yeah. Thank you. So you've also led, the reason why we want to talk today is large-scale mental health disasters, as well as small ones. When you were in New York and you were commissioner of 9/11, you also dealt FEMA response, mental health aspects when Hurricane Sandy, and many other things. You're also an accomplished author with many, like 12 books, 13 books, and one of them, his newest, we're going to talk about today, The Ink-Stained Life. Lloyd is a natural raconteur, is also an expert. So, Dr. Sederer, welcome to our show. Thank you.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'll try to live up to it, John.
On the show, we talk about the challenges we're all facing today, and you have actually lived this in multiple capacities. So you've led disaster relief efforts as they've related to mental health crises. Certainly, we're in that now. So tell us about it. What's the approach? What do you look for?
Well, let me describe two, or one and then another, which was when I was very new to the job of being mental health commissioner in New York City. 9/11 what happened, and my agency applied for a federal relief grant, a FEMA grant, and we obtained it, which was a $137 million grant to be spent over 3 years, providing some necessary and useful mental health response to people who were affected by 9/11. Excuse me, I'm trying to censor this. There we go.
That's okay.
And we did, and what we established was called Project Liberty, which was an effort to identify those people impacted who were at the highest risk, who were exposed the most, who lost the most, and many others, and to then do what FEMA approves, which is not psychotherapy. It is called crisis counseling. And we provided crisis counseling, individual and group, to 750,000 New Yorkers over the course of those 3 years. And I think we helped quite a few people, and we studied it while we were doing it. So we learned some really important things about who's at risk. What are the protective factors? What are the factors that you want to mobilize to rebound, to recover? Because the FEMA approach, and for most people, it's about finding your own capabilities, mobilizing them, energizing them, and that's what we did. We trained hundreds of people, largely master's level people in mental health and social services, in crisis counseling, and then we deployed them to those individuals we know most impacted, particularly people in the area of Lower Manhattan where Ground Zero happened.
Great. Well, it's interesting you said that 750,000 people were served, and but that is such an a much greater number than one would have thought. So what were and I think it's related to where we are right now. One thinks of the direct victims and survivors. What goes beyond that, Lloyd? What other kinds of folks are affected? So.
What we know about disaster trauma in particular, is that the greater the exposure and the greater the duration of the exposure, the more likely someone will go beyond distress into some kind of disorder, whether it's a depression or traumatic or addiction. And so we concentrated on the Lower Manhattan, but many people there in the towers lived in other places. They lived in Westchester or New Jersey, so we had to go to those people. But there's a type of halo effect which we discovered, which was not only those most exposed, but rather those who were witnesses, even by television or through stories from other people. And we discovered really a very important thing, which we turned into a tagline. We discovered that vast numbers of people in the wake of that disaster, just like COVID, which is a disaster, experience distress. They feel anxious. And what we said and what we showed over time is that it is normal to feel anxious in an abnormal time. Right. And that certainly was an abnormal time. And boy, are we living in an abnormal time right now. So it was not about giving therapy to these people. It was about giving them some perspective that this is, and trying to normalize their experience, and then tap, as we said before, into their own native resources, supports, adaptive capabilities.
Well, I want to pick up on that. Something, normalize the abnormal. And that relates to us now because our world is totally turned upside down. We have a pandemic. As a result of that, we also have economic fragility. Many people have lost their jobs and their jobs will not be coming back. We also have the ugliness and the stigma of social injustice, which has raised its head. So we are in abnormal time. So how do we normalize it, and should we normalize it? So,
that is a really good list of the consequences, but I'd like to add one more, John.
No more.
The consequences of social isolation. Because the very thing that we humans need to rebound from being knocked over are other people. People we trust, people we care about, who care about us. And we're appropriately being told, don't spend time with other people. And so ironically, one of the solutions to COVID is very contrary to the human need for social connection. So that makes it an even more malevolent disease. There's its contagion, its virulence, its impact on financing and people's homes, and then we're all to do this isolated as we are. And my message for most people is, do that. You're much more apt to stay alive and keep other people alive, but over-communicate, because you have essentially a deficit in human connectedness. And what does that mean? It means don't be shy about calling somebody. Don't be shy about having regular Zoom calls once a week or more with friends or people whom you used to have dinner with regularly. Over communicate because it closes the gap somewhat, not fully, but it closes the gap somewhat.
And so we strive. I'm glad you brought up the social isolation. And I apologize, my image is a little blurred for the moment. So that's life in our pigtail world, shall we say. So I'm not going to accept that abnormal. I'm going to work through it. So
I don't know if it's about accepting the abnormal. It is about recognizing and being adaptive. And the major message that we took from 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, storms, fires, and whatnot, was that people are resilient. We humans are resilient. That's why we're still alive now, not just during this disaster, but for millions or hundreds of thousands of years. It's innate to be resilient. But there are factors that get in the way of resilience, and there are factors that help promote it. Factors that get in the way are trauma, the prior experience of trauma, whether it's childhood trauma, forced immigration, domestic violence. People exposed to that in a serious and protracted way have changes literally in their brains, in their brain circuitry, and in their psychology. And they're much more prone to react to that anxiety or to the worries. That trauma is one very big factor.
Right.
It doesn't help also if you're isolated, not just isolated because of COVID, but because you live a life of isolation or live a life disconnect. You don't have family or others that you spend time with. And poverty, food uncertainty, these are all factors that contribute to eroding our capacity to bounce back, to be resilient.
It's good. You also experienced worked in mental health challenges, crisis counseling for Hurricane Sandy. And
Yeah.
so you told me about the public, what are the public messages that need to get out when we're suffering these, experiencing, enduring this, our crises?
So we had two taglines, if you will. One just mentioned, which is that it's normal to feel anxious in an abnormal time. The second one was even heroes need to talk. And with 9/11, there was a huge impact on first responders, heroes, literally, or firefighters, police, EMTs, the people who worked the cleanup. These were heroes. And in some ways, over time, that word, I think, has been turned upside down. That people don't feel like heroes. When you ask real heroes, or people who have thrown themselves into something, risked danger to themselves, sacrifice, they don't see themselves as heroes.
No.
They see themselves as doing their job. They see themselves in a way, they recognize the importance of contribution to others, of sacrifice, because in many ways that's what we're most proud of, not taking but giving.
Right, and well, let's raise that issue because I know in the corporate environment, my wife is a team leader, managing director, so she's got a lot of direct reports and stuff. So, what are things that, and we're all in this isolation stuff, Zoom calls and things like that. How can what things should executives be looking for? Warning signs of stress or not. I mean, we're all feeling stress, but where someone might need extra help. Do you have any advice on that, Lloyd?
So. I do, because, and particularly because since the spring, I've been involved with work related to physician and nurse distress in New York and in Boston as a result of COVID. These are the frontline COVID workers. And the first thing your wife and others in leadership positions need to recognize is that many people, particularly professional people, will not tell you, will not show you their distress. They're too proud, or it in some ways is contrary to their mission, to their calling. So you won't get it from them. I mean, you may get it from them, but it may be too late at that point. They may have done something destructive to themselves or otherwise. It is about saying to whoever you're working with that there are certain things that will help you, and they're very practical. And like sleep and social contact and whatnot. But what we wound up doing in this project was we recorded the private conversations of 20 pairs of frontline physicians at Massachusetts General Hospital and New York Presbyterian Hospital. And it was actually reported, a long report in the Sunday Times on June 22nd, called Doctors Are COVID's First Historians. And we recorded these as private conversations on a platform. Bongo is the company, a Bongo platform. So at their convenience, one doctor selected another doctor that they knew at the same hospital, a neighboring hospital, and they arranged for Zoom calls, private Zoom calls. And they were 10 minutes minimum, but many of them lasted a half hour. And I saw a lot of those. And what I saw more than anything else was peer support. That's what really helped these doctors, because who could they turn to? They didn't want to turn to their family or spouse or sister, brother, because they knew they couldn't have the same experience, the horror, the being overwhelmed, helpless. So they needed to turn to those who were experiencing the same thing. And they certainly wouldn't show, particularly doctors, their service chiefs, or the heads of the hospitals, that they were in trouble. But they were inclined to these conversations. And they were normal. We offered during the conversation some guiding questions. How do you feel? What do you fear? What do you hope for? And we saw these extraordinary exchanges. In fact, in the Times article online.
It reminds me of something too that we all went through. Well, that our military went through during our still going through, but with PTSD. What helped bring so many soldiers to care was when the officers spoke out. Because the military, like physicians, has a tradition of we suck it up. And if you don't do that, so is there a degree of that too, as owning my own problem?
So. And transparency goes a long way in the wake of disaster. Transparency of information, transparency of your own experience, which you're describing. This reaches people. This is what they need, and they also remarkably benefit. It was sort of like discovering water once again, because peer support has been essential to so many conditions, whether it's alcohol addiction, drug addiction, breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis. It is about people who are going through the same troubles, talking with one another, exchanging ideas, but mostly appreciating what was going on in the other person. That is very beneficial.
Yeah. As you well know, and you said it, what provokes crisis, what provokes anxiety, is this feeling of uncertainty. And it's a leader's job to provide clarity. Well, what happens when a leader can't provide that clarity? Fear enters. So what advice do you have for leaders experiencing fear? How do they deal with it?
Well, they still have to be transparent. It's okay to offer just whatever information you have, however limited it is. Not to gloss over, not to exaggerate, because that's what people feel is authentic. If you or your wife or somebody says, at this point, we don't have very much information about whatever, but, we're going to continue to be speaking with you every day or whatever, and offering information as much as we get you're going to know about it. Then you essentially create a bond between you, an authentic bond, because you're not. It's not pretense. It's not boasting. It is reality, and that's very important. And the transparency also. You have to be very careful, I think, about this in terms of leaders talking about themselves. You want some sense that you too, your life is upside down. You know, your kids don't go to school, whatever. That's important. But as a leader, what you have to hold on to is hope. You have to believe yourself and enable other people to believe that as tough as this is, like every other disaster, we're going to get through it. We're going to suffer. There's going to be some lingering, sometimes very long-standing consequences, but people are resilient. Communities are, economies are. We will recover.
Well, now, one of the messages I have shared with people is when their uncertainty is, and the leader, none of us knows what's going to happen. And if they did, they're probably crazy. So we shouldn't follow. But I've always said, and something to you, and I want to get your bounce on this, Lloyd, because I've said to leaders when they're providing clarity, talk to your people, be as honest and transparent as possible. But say, I think it's what you said. I believe in you. I believe we have the resources that we'll get through. Is that a valid concept?
Absolutely. That's crisis counseling done and en masse. Because it is believing, which is true, that all of us have some inner strength, inner capacity. And one of the interesting, really important findings in our studies from those disasters, others, was that a really significant predictor of recovery was faith. Faith. And it didn't need to be in the form of an organized religion. Sure, it could be. But for many, it was about their own sense of spirituality, their own sense of being connected to a larger worldly universe community, a sense that they're not alone. Those were strong predictors, because what we also want to do is encourage people to find that in themselves. It's there for most people, and don't be ashamed of it. Mobilize it because it helps.
I loved how you integrated faith into this, and you made differential, because some of us are spiritual, some of us are not, some different things. When a leader's saying, Lloyd, that I have belief and trust in you, is that a form of faith too? So
I think so. Don't you, John?
I firmly believe it, but I'm asking you. You're the expert.
No, so are you. So are we all. Your viewers, I hope, ask themselves the same question, and that they answered yes.
Okay. Now, you were telling me, I know you have some stories coming up, but you were telling me a story of kindness that you experienced when you were working in France. Am I correct on that? So,
yeah. I wasn't working, but my wife and I have spent for many years time in rural France, not in Paris, in a tiny village, maybe 300 people or so. And at the centerpiece of the town is this massive 11th century abbey. And the town is a historic site. It is on what is a very well known for many people, particularly Catholics, pilgrimage trail called the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage trail, which my wife and I have walked. We completed it last year. But so through the town, pass 200-300 pilgrims, more or less every night from the spring to the fall, and stay at the abbey has dormitories, etc., etc. What one time, and there was for a long, there's a tradition in the town of gathering on Wednesday mornings and going for a walk. It's not quite a hike, but it's more than a walk. It's several hours of walking into these ancient forests around the town. And usually there'd be 15 or 20 of us who would gather. And one morning, in addition to the regulars, there were about 20 young Black people, men, principally men, but women as well. And what were they? Where did they come from? Well, it turns out they they were being supported to escape and find refuge in the suburbs of Paris by an organization, not-for-profit organization called Limbo, which was started by a phenomenal documentarian in France, and she's won all kinds of prizes. And it was called, in French, Voyage en Barbarie, a barbarous voyage. And she told the story of these young men and some women who would flee Ethiopia, Eritrea, sometimes the Sudan, and to save their lives. They weren't going for economic opportunity. They were going to be killed or whatnot, or starve to death there. And at the borders where they would escape, there were these gangs who would kidnap them, many of them, and take them to ransom camps in the Sinai, and where they would torture them and where they would call their family it was terrible while they were suffering, and ask for money. These were poor families, but they would extort money from these families. And some of them managed to escape the camps, which moved to Libya, actually, and were supported in doing that by this organization, Limbo. And Limbo also then, or the some of the brothers, which is what the priests are called at this abbey, made contact with this documentarian, Cécile Allegra, and said, "What can we do?" I mean, she was trying to support them in the Paris area, and she said, "Well, whatever you can." And the village mobilized, and it found a home for a refugee family, and then it became a regular uh, haven, if you will, for groups of these traumatized young men and women. And they were there, like many other times, I just hadn't been there at the other times, to find some peace, to recognize that there's a life different from the life in a ransom camp or in a tyrant's country. And they were walking with us that day. And it had rained the night before terribly. It was a beautiful day. And we were on, it's pretty steep mountainside or hillside. And I had good boots, a hiking stick, but I had back surgery not too long after that. And I could not make it down some of the switchbacks. I just couldn't. I was going to fall and tumble down hill. And a number of them came up to me and said, can we help? And I would, and at the beginning, I said, no merci, ça va, it's okay. But I was not okay. And then one of the men, in his early 20s, who was actually the tallest and the strongest looking among them, he just came up to me. He didn't say a word. He just took me by the arms, and he didn't carry me, but he made sure that I got down to the town safely. And this was unasked for. It was an intentional, on his part, act of kindness. And for somebody who spent years in those camps, who was tortured beyond belief, to have in him the wish to be kind to some old guy trying to get down a mountain, it was deeply powerful experience. And I spent more time with them because they were there for a week or two. And I saw how they were rebuilding their lives, but it was very hard.
Well, that's an inspirational story, especially for our times as we're feeling pressures. Well, we're not experiencing the trauma that of the young men that you spoke about. But now we're coming to the end of our show. But I do want you to hold up a picture, or hold up your book, and I want you to read a passage from it, if you would. So,
yeah. So I'm going to read a passage, and as we discussed, you're going to put up a photo at a certain point.
That's right. Yeah.
Because my book, it's a series of stories, but I have what are concluding thoughts, a section at the end. And one of the sections of that chapter goes into faith, into the subject of faith. So we're going to start with that and talk about my experience of the immanence of God. Okay. There feels to me to be something preternatural going on beyond the limits of our vision, and I am not given to conspiracy theories. I also have felt over many years and in different ways the presence of those forces, their immanence in all that abounds about us, the fertile earth, the life-giving rain, the fury of the seas, and all living things, plants, animals, birds, and fish, insects, etc., including what we have yet to witness. This view I espouse is that God is immanent and is held by and we evidence that immanence if we open our eyes, if we take the time to see the extraordinary circumstances that we have. So I'm going to now, this goes on. One moment I'd like to report with this photo happened not many years ago. And I was saying, over 10 years, my wife and I walked and completed the ancient pilgrimage trail, the Compostela Trail. And it's 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles from South Central France, through the Pyrenees, over the Napoleon Trail, and into northern Spain, and then due west to the sea. Make sure I got the next page. Yes, okay. So, we were on the trail one of those years. We were near Pamplona, Spain. And that morning, the going this was in October or November, that had been awful that morning. Heavy winds, horizontal rain, a violent hailstorm, a bit biblical, I admit. We were beaten down, soaked, even to our socks and boots. And then it stopped. And my wife said, "Look behind you." And I did. And that's what I saw. That rainbow, that immanence, because God is a force of nature. God is the force that takes lives and gives lives and makes for the extraordinary beauty and diversity of our world. And that was, for me, was an experience of awe because it was a metaphor for me. It was about going from really horrible, horizontal, right? Hail, big hail, getting knocked by hail, walking in water in your boots, and then it ended, and then the beauty was right there.
That's such a good thought to end on. And because you've touched on some of the elements of grace that I like to talk about. Awe is one, okay. Cognizant that we're not in this alone. There are others, or people of faith believe in transcendent, but also the sense of, this unity, this word nature of God. So Lloyd, you've been a terrific guest. How can people find you? So
I think the best way is to go to my website, ASKDRLL AskDrLloyd.com,
Great.
which is the DRLLOYD. And because that's where I put up many of the things I have written or talks I've given. It's free. You can subscribe to it. And you can pick and choose. There may be a subject you want to look at or learn about or teach me about, I hope. So that's the best way. AskDrLloyd.com.
Great. And we will put that in the notes for the program. Thank you very much, Dr. Lloyd Sederer. You've been a terrific guest. And with that, I say thank you as we close out. So,
thank you, John.